Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show host or the guest are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's May the 8th, and we have a lot of good stuff to get to today. If you missed last week's big announcement, I think it bears repeating. The RealTalk MS podcast has its own Alexa skill that you can access through your Amazon Echo, Dot, or any Alexa-enabled device. So all you have to say is, Alexa, enable the RealTalk MS podcast, and from then on, you'll be able to listen to our latest podcast episode. You'll be able to easily navigate to any past episode. You'll be able to fast forward and rewind within each episode, and you'll even be able to pause the podcast, come back later, and pick up exactly where you left off. We'll put a link in the show notes so that you can check out all the details, but if you have an Amazon Alexa-enabled device, this is the way you want to listen to podcasts at home. And I say that from my own firsthand experience. It's pretty great. And beyond just being incredibly convenient, I consider devices like the Amazon Echo or Dot to be best-in-class assistive technology devices. If it's challenging for you to use a mouse or a keyboard or a phone, you need to know about all the things that you can accomplish with an Alexa-enabled device. And that's something that we're definitely going to be talking about in an upcoming episode, because these devices can be game changers when it comes to everyday quality of life. As a matter of fact, I've become such a fan for what these devices are capable of doing that we're going to be giving away an Amazon Echo Dot in the next couple of weeks. So keep listening to the podcast, and you just might pick up an Echo Dot with our compliments. If you're a regular listener, then you already know that I'm a big believer in self-empowerment through self-advocacy. I just think that there's so much to be gained through advocating on your own behalf. And if you're a regular listener, you've heard me on more than one occasion urge you to become an MS activist. Well, whether you're living with MS, diabetes, cancer, or almost any illness that you can think of, there's one thing that most of us can probably agree on, and that's the sad fact that here in the United States, prescription drugs cost too much. For people living with MS, the cost of prescription drugs is ridiculously high. And yet, that cost continues to increase each and every year. In 2004, the average wholesale price of available MS disease-modifying therapies was $16,000, and that was a lot of money. Well, in 2013, the average price was $61,000, and that was ridiculous. Last year, the average price was more than $83,000. And that's obscene. Just let those numbers sink in for a minute, and you'll understand why I was so anxious to bring on my guest this week. He's an activist, and he leads activists, and you may want to add your voice to his advocacy efforts. My guest is David Mitchell, and David is the founder and president of Patients for Affordable Drugs. David has an incurable blood cancer called multiple myeloma, and the annual cost of his current drug treatment is $450,000. And not only did David decide that it was unacceptable to charge almost $500,000 a year for the prescription drugs he required just to survive, he also decided to do something about it. So after more than 30 years at a Washington, D.C. policy communications firm, David retired at the end of 2016 to devote his full energy to helping change public policy to lower prescription drug prices. We're going to talk with David all about Patients for Affordable Drugs, but before we do, there are a few other things that you should know about. small study indicates that autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, known more simply as AHSCT, is safe and highly effective in treating patients with aggressive multiple sclerosis. And before we get into the specifics of this study, let me first say that among people living with MS, there's a lot of confusion about stem cell therapy. And a lot of that confusion comes from so-called stem cell clinics that are operating barely within and sometimes outside the boundaries of legal and ethical practice, spending a lot of money not on research, but on marketing. And what most of them are selling is not the stem cell therapy that was used in this study. And honestly, I think this is such an important distinction to make that I'll be devoting an upcoming episode of the podcast to talk about what I consider to be a scam that takes advantage of well-meaning people who are desperately looking for some sort of miracle cure. We'll be talking to experts in the field of stem cell research, and we'll really break down and explain the differences between treatment that seems to be worthwhile and what seems to be nothing more than a very expensive scam. But today's news has nothing to do with the scams being run by these so-called clinics. In autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, chemotherapy or radiation is used to first prep the patient's immune system, and then the patient's own healthy bone marrow stem cells are transplanted. In this study, 19 patients who had been diagnosed with aggressive MS and who had never received any MS disease-modifying drug therapy received AHSCT. The patients were treated at several different clinical centers in the UK, Sweden, Canada, and Italy. The median age of the patients was 33. And they had a median disability score of 6.5 using the Expanded Disability Status Score, or EDSS. 30 months after the stem cell transplant, the patients had a median EDSS score of 2.0. And as a reminder, the higher your EDSS score, the worse your level of disability. None of the patients had an MS relapse after the stem cell transplant. And based upon these very positive results, the research team reported that autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation is safe and highly effective in inducing, quote, rapid and sustained remission in highly active MS, and was, quote, associated with a significant improvement of patients' level of disability, end quote. The research team concluded that AHSCT should be considered as first-line therapy in patients with aggressive MS. Well, you can be sure that we'll continue to follow and keep you updated on stem cell transplantation and the work that's being done in what seems to be a promising direction in treating MS. Physical exercise is good for almost everyone. But many people living with MS often avoid exercise because it causes them to overheat, and that leads to exhaustion. But the results of a small study suggest that a potential solution to this particular challenge might be as simple as taking a couple of aspirin. The study recruited 12 people with MS, and 8 of the 12 people reported that they were sensitive to heat. The group of 12 people participated in 2 one-hour exercise sessions 1 week apart. Before each exercise session, half the group was given a standard 650 milligram dose of aspirin, and the other half received a placebo. After each of the 2 exercise sessions, each member of the group performed an exercise test to the point where they were completely physically exhausted. The research team looked at how long it took for each participant to reach the point of physical exhaustion and the change in their body temperature from pre-exercise to post-exercise. And the results indicated that the group that had been given aspirin before each exercise session could exercise longer before reaching the point of exhaustion. And among the heat-sensitive members of the group, the benefit was even more pronounced. The heat-sensitive group of participants also showed a 56% reduction in body temperature increase after being given aspirin. Heat sensitivity is a symptom of MS that gets in the way and can really impact quality of life. This small study points to aspirin, which is convenient, very affordable, and readily available, as an effective treatment that might allow many more people with MS to gain the benefit of physical exercise. Hopefully, we'll see a larger study launched to further explore this simple possibility. While we're talking about simplifying our lives, perhaps you'd like to take care of all of your regular check-in appointments with your neurologist from the comfort of your own home, or even while you're at the office. Because the reality is that for many MS patients, sometimes just getting to and from medical appointments can be logistically difficult. Acknowledging this potential obstacle, the MS Center at the University of California, San Francisco routinely provides televideo appointments for its established patients. And for most of 2017, 5 MS Center physicians and their patients were surveyed after completing 50 televideo appointments and 100 in-person appointments at the clinic. And here's what the numbers showed. Overall, the patients opting for televideo appointments were older, with an average age of just over 51, compared with an average age of 44 for those patients who preferred in-person appointments. 96% of the patients who chose the televideo appointment were white, compared with 74% of the patients who chose in-person appointments and were white. The physicians reported that they were satisfied with the televideo appointments 96% of the time. Of the patients participating in these televideo appointments, 80% participated from home and 20% participated from work. 33% of the patients indicated that the televideo appointment let them avoid taking a day off from work. 55% of the patients indicated that the televideo appointments let them avoid having to arrange for childcare or care for other dependents in their home. And 86% of the patients strongly agreed that they felt they had achieved their clinical goals through these televideo appointments. The study concluded that these televideo appointments, sometimes also called telemedicine, reduced travel costs and caregiver burden, and enabled convenient and effective follow-up. There's a lot to be said when technology can step in and simplify our lives. If there's one thing that doesn't seem to be very simple, it's understanding how the cost of MS disease-modifying prescription drugs continues to rise at an astronomical rate. In a moment, we'll meet my guest, David Mitchell. David is the founder and president of Patients for Affordable Drugs. David Mitchell has an incurable blood cancer called multiple myeloma. The cost of his current drug treatment is $450,000 a year. David requires scientific innovation that's going to lead to new drugs for his survival. But he believes that for drugs to be fully effective, people have to be able to afford them. And that's why David's the founder and president of Patients for Affordable Drugs, where he's committed to helping change policy to lower prescription drug prices. Patients for Affordable Drugs is an organization that mobilizes patients and allies at the federal and state levels and doesn't accept funding from any organizations that profit from the development or distribution of prescription drugs. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Before we get into the work that Patients for Affordable Drugs is doing, can you walk us through how you got to the point of founding your organization?
Yes. So I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma about 7.5 years ago. And as you mentioned, the drugs to treat my disease are very expensive. And the experience of fighting the cancer and doing it through these expensive drugs was really searing for me. And I became increasingly frustrated as a patient because there were very few patient groups speaking out to try and lower drug prices. And so I was getting up in age. I was wondering if I had a next act, and one day I thought, geez, maybe I should just retire and work on this issue and see if we can change things. My wife said, yes, I could. And so we did, and we established Patients for Affordable Drugs.
A couple of weeks ago, the Healthcare Cost Institute came out with a report that showed that between the years 2006 and 2015, the cost of healthcare almost doubled for people living with multiple sclerosis. And by far, the single thing driving what I'll call a catastrophic increase in healthcare cost was the almost constantly rising cost of MS prescription medications. So most of our listeners in the United States are all too familiar with the unaffordability of prescription drugs. So how do we begin to even address this problem?
Well, let me start by saying that we've heard from tens of thousands of patients across the country, and many of them are multiple sclerosis patients, and they are struggling to buy their drugs. And you know that, your listeners know that. It's amazing. You mentioned a couple of statistics. One that I am familiar with is that in 2004, core disease MS cost $16,000, and in 2017, those very same drugs cost $84,000. So it's remarkable. How do we get our arms around this problem? Well, the whole system is set up to benefit the people who make money on it, the drug companies, the pharmacy benefit managers who run prescription drug insurance programs. Even doctors and hospitals can make more money on more expensive drugs. So we need to get at the whole system, but the starting place, in our view, is we need to lower list prices that are set by drug companies as the starting point. And one way to do that would be, for example, to let Medicare negotiate directly with the drug companies. Right now in this country, we're the only country in the world, developed country, that doesn't negotiate directly with the drug companies. Instead, with Medicare, we have these pharmacy benefit managers negotiate on our behalf, and the result is that we literally pay 2 to 3 times more than people in other developed countries. So we think a starting point would be to allow Medicare to negotiate on behalf of people covered by Medicare, but that would ripple down the whole system and help lower prices. There are other steps we could take too, but that's a first step we could take.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Medicare as a federal program. This past year, California became the first state in the country to pass a prescription drug price transparency bill. And while it's not a perfect bill, not a perfect law, it's a step in perhaps a more perfect direction. And I know that other states are looking to replicate California's new law. And I'm wondering if you think that maybe the battle for prescription drug price transparency is going to take place at the state and maybe not the federal level.
I think it is right now, Jonathan. There is more action in the states by far than there is in Washington, D.C. And there are, as you say, other drug price transparency and notification bills making their way through legislatures around the country. A bill passed in Oregon. There are bills in Colorado, bills in Illinois, and elsewhere. Point is, to just reiterate what you said, states who have to balance their budgets and who are on the hook for a lot of Medicaid costs are responding to high drug prices and taking actions. And while drug price transparency and notification bills don't fix the problem all by themselves, as you said, they are a step in the right direction, and they're happening in more and more places.
As they're happening, unfortunately, as the law in California has happened, it's already being challenged in court by the pharmaceutical industry. They have incredibly deep pockets. Even if they feel it's a losing proposition, they can tie this up for years as it works its way up the judicial chain. So just how long term is the fight for affordable drug prices likely to be?
It's a long march. There's no doubt about that. We are making progress in the states, and we are, in fact, making some progress at the federal level. And, we look forward to a Congress in 2019 that might be more friendly toward efforts to lower prescription drug prices. But there is progress happening right now, even today. About 2 hours ago, the Supreme Court handed down a decision in a case that upheld the ability of consumers and others to challenge weak patents in order to clear the way for generics to come to market sooner. The case is called Oil States, and pharma had challenged an administrative process that is faster and less expensive to challenge patents, and the court upheld this administrative process by a vote of 7-2. This was a serious defeat for pharma, which had gone to court to say this is not fair. This is taking away our patents without due process in a federal circuit court. And so just today, we had a step forward. Now, will the ability to challenge patents faster get us cheaper generics tomorrow? No, but this is going to have an impact for years to come in terms of helping generics come to market faster and to stop the drug companies from using weak patents to block cheaper generics.
That's good news. Any movement in the right direction is certainly welcome and good news. I guess I have the $3.5 billion question. Over the past 20 years, pharmaceutical and healthcare product industries have spent more than $3.5 billion on lobbying efforts. They spend more on lobbying than any other industry in the world. How do we effectively offset their efforts at influencing our legislators?
Well, first of all, Jonathan, what you just said was just borne out. A report came out last week that pharma, the main lobbying arm for the drug companies, spent almost $10 million in the first quarter of this year, more than they'd ever spent in a single quarter. So pharma feels under attack and threatened, and that's a good thing. How do we beat them? Well, increasingly, there are more groups mobilizing to push for policies that will lower drug prices. So we are all working together. The Multiple Sclerosis Society is certainly a leader in this, but AARP, family physicians, internists, a lot of groups who represent consumers and patients are pushing for change. And so we have more resources in play, but the way we beat them, I honestly believe, is with our voices and our votes. We have got to stand up and demand action in our state legislatures and in Congress to change the policies so that pharma can no longer abuse patients and take advantage of a rigged system. So we might not be able to match them dollar for dollar. We can't. But with enough of us, enough resources, enough organization, and if we all stand up together, we can win some.
I'm glad you mentioned taking action, because one of the most constant themes, I would say, throughout all of my podcast episodes is reminding my listeners that the most important thing they can do for themselves is to advocate on their own behalf and become activists. And this is certainly an issue that strikes at the very pocketbook of every family who's dependent on prescription drugs. And that's an awful lot of families across this country. So I know I'm going to be, when we publish the show notes for the podcast, I'll be adding phone numbers where people can call the congressional switchboard and leave word for their legislators about how important this issue is to them. And while I'm doing that, why don't you tell us where people can find out more about Patients for Affordable Drugs and what your organization is up to?
So come to patientsforaffordabledrugs.org. We would ask a couple of things if you want to join with us. We ask only that you consider leaving us your story. We take the stories. We have 13,000 stories, and they're on a map on our website. We take the stories and elevate them and amplify them to policymakers and elected officials. So A, please leave us your story. B, we'd like your email address and zip code so that we can follow up with you, because we do mobilizations. We did mobilizations in California, for example, in support of the bill you described. And so we reach out, and when there's something that we can do together that would help lower drug prices, we contact people and mobilize them. We don't ask for donations from patients because they're struggling enough. They want to leave a couple of bucks with us, they can. But the main thing we want is the stories and the email addresses so that we can amplify our voices in support of change. Patientsforaffordabledrugs.org.
Great. And once again, we're going to be adding a link to your website on the show notes so that people will have very little work to do in order to join forces. And let me thank you once again, David, for leading the charge on such an important issue that impacts the quality of life for just so many families across the country. Thanks for everything you do, and thanks for spending a few minutes with us today.
Jonathan, thank you for your leadership. Your leadership and its impact extends beyond the multiple sclerosis community because you're a voice that is speaking out in a way that will help all of us. I'm a cancer patient, but, all of us. So thank you.
That's going to wrap up this week's episode of Real Talk MS. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, I invite you to do so. You can find the Real Talk MS podcast at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play Music, wherever you find the best podcasts. And if you have an Amazon Echo or Dot at home, you can just say, Alexa, enable the Real Talk MS podcast. I'd like to say that if you can, please take a moment and leave a rating and review for the podcast. To do that, just head to realtalkms.com/rating, RATING, and you'll be able to leave an iTunes rating and review. It takes just a minute or two, and I really appreciate it. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.